village of Cranley St. James was, by all appearances, a place of idyllic peace. Nestled among rolling green hills, with stone cottages covered in ivy and a church spire that had stood for centuries. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, but appearances, as Miss Marple well knew, could be terribly misleading. It was just past 4 o'clock on an unseasonably warm afternoon when the first ripple of scandal and unease began to spread. The event that started it all was entirely ordinary. The ringing of the bell at the Larkspur tea room, where the ladies of the village often gathered for their afternoon refreshment. It was Mrs. Edith Fullerton, the proprietress of the tea shop, who first noticed something strange. She had just finished pouring tea for Miss Jane Marple when she happened to glance toward the grand clock on the wall. It's the same clock that had marked the passing hours for the tea room for over 30 years. She frowned. "That's odd," she murmured. Miss Marple, seated comfortably with her knitting in hand, looked up with mild interest. "What is, dear?" Mrs. Fullerton pointed. The clock stopped. Miss Marple followed her gaze. Indeed, the ornate brass clock, which always ticked along with unwavering precision, had frozen at 3:15 p.m. Now, Miss Marple was not one to be alarmed by small mechanical failures, but even so, she had learned to pay attention to details, especially when something unusual happened in a place where nothing unusual was expected. And so, as Mrs. Fullerton fussed about the stopped clock, Miss Marple simply sat back, sipping her tea, and let her sharp mind begin to work. Because if there was one thing she had learned in her many years of quietly observing human nature, it was this: when a clock stops unexpectedly, it is often a sign of something much greater. The next morning, Miss Marple was proven right. Word had already begun to spread through the village, traveling as quickly as gossip in Cranley St. James always did. By midday, the entire town was buzzing with whispers. A crime had been committed, a crime that had happened at precisely 3:15 p.m. And suddenly, the silent clock in the Larkspur tea room was no longer just a curiosity. It was a clue. The discovery had been made. At Hazelwood House, the grandest residence in Cranley St. James. It belonged to Colonel Geoffrey Bainbridge, retired military officer of impeccable standing, known for his love of order, punctuality, and an almost obsessive adherence to routine. And yet, at 3:15 p.m. the previous afternoon, Colonel Bainbridge had been murdered. The details were as shocking as they were puzzling. He had been found in his study, seated at his desk, as if in the middle of writing a letter. His fountain pen lay on the paper, ink still wet. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no indication that anything had been stolen. But the most peculiar thing of all, the grandfather clock in the study, a magnificent antique piece that had stood in Hazelwood House for generations, had also stopped at precisely 3:15 p.m., just like the clock in the Larkspur tea room, and just like Colonel Bainbridge himself. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news from her dear friend, Mrs. Elspeth Hartnell, simply nodded. "A clock that stops at the exact moment a man is murdered," she murmured. "Yes, my dear, I do believe we have quite the mystery on our hands." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Hazelwood House. The air was thick with mourning and hushed voices, constables, and a low hum of speculation. She was greeted by Inspector Leonard Graves, a stout man with a perpetual frown, who regarded Miss Marple with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding, "I suppose it was only a matter of time before you arrived." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I do so hate to impose, but a dreadful crime has been committed, and I couldn't help but be curious." Inspector Graves sighed. "Well, since you're here, you may as well have a look around. But mind you, this is official police business." Miss Marple nodded demurely, but behind her soft blue eyes, her mind was already working. She had not stepped more than 3 feet into the study before she noticed something most interesting. Single sheet of paper resting on the desk. With the colonel's unfinished letter, she peered at the elegant, controlled handwriting. To whom it may concern, it read, I must put an end to this at once. The truth must come out before, and then it stopped. Sentence. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A man who intends to reveal the truth. She murmured to herself, often does not live long enough to do so. Over the next few hours, a clearer picture of Colonel Bainbridge's last days emerged. He had been a man of routine, discipline, and strict principles. But lately, he had been restless, unsettled. His household staff had noticed it. His neighbors had whispered about it. And just days before his murder, he had told a close friend something most unusual. There is something terribly wrong in Cranley St. James, and I intend to put an end to it. Miss Marple frowned as she listened to the accounts, because one thing was now certain. Colonel Bainbridge had known something that had led to his death, and Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and sharper mind, intended to find out what. It was by the time Miss Marple left Hazelwood House. The sun was setting over Cranley St. James, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets. She paused outside, adjusting her knitted shawl, before glancing back at the house one last time. Someone inside that house had killed Colonel Bainbridge. Someone had stopped his clock, silenced him forever. And yet, as Miss Marple walked back toward the village, she could not shake the feeling that the true mystery had only just begun, because the colonel was not the only one with secrets, and in Cranley St. James, it was only a matter of time before the next truth was revealed. The village of Cranley St. James had always prided itself on being a place of order and civility, where the most scandalous events usually revolved around baking competitions gone awry, or Mrs. Hargreaves' unfortunate habit of adding too much sherry to the Christmas pudding. But now, for the first time in many years, the village was gripped by something far darker: murder. And not just any murder, the murder of Colonel Geoffrey Bainbridge, a man whose very presence had once commanded authority. The discovery of his lifeless body in his study, his unfinished letter resting beside him, had sent ripples of shock and speculation through every tea shop, every drawing room, every whispered conversation behind lace curtains. And in the middle of it all, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened, because if there was one thing she knew about human nature, it was this: people talked. In their talking, they revealed far more than they intended. By the next morning, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. Miss Marple had just settled herself at the Bluebell Tea Room, her preferred spot for both refreshment and quiet observation, when she was joined by Mrs. Beatrice Withers and Mrs. Lavinia Ambrose, both of whom arrived flushed with excitement. Miss Marple, have you heard? Mrs. Withers leaned in breathlessly, her voice hushed. They say it was poison. Miss Marple, whose tea had been perfectly brewed, did not immediately respond. She merely took a small sip, allowing the words to linger. Mrs. Ambrose sniffed disdainfully. Honestly, Beatrice, where do you get such ideas? The colonel was shot. The police said so. Well, I heard it was a heart attack, Mrs. Withers countered, and that someone tampered with the clocks to make it look like something it wasn't. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her lap, her expression pleasant. And where, my dear? Did you hear that? Mrs. Withers faltered. Well, from Mrs. Cartwright, of course. And she heard it from Dr. Lester's housekeeper, who Mrs. Ambrose let out a scoffing noise. Oh, don't be ridiculous, Beatrice. A heart attack? Tampered clocks? No. I heard from Mr. Graves himself that the colonel was killed at precisely 3:15 p.m. And if that's true, then the question we should be asking is, she paused dramatically, lowering her voice, who was with them at that very moment? Hushed silence settled over the table. Miss Marple did not speak, but she noticed She always did that at the mention of the exact time of death. Mrs. Withers' fingers twitched slightly over the rim of her teacup, a small thing, a minor tremor, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that small things were never insignificant. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll toward Hazelwood House, its grand facade now eerily silent. The police had finished their initial investigations, leaving behind a house that felt far emptier than before. Colonel Bainbridge had lived alone, save for his housekeeper, Mrs. Alice Pettigrew, a woman of strict discipline and sharp opinions. Miss Marple found her standing just outside the entrance, wringing her apron in nervous fingers. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Miss Marple greeted, her voice warm. "A terrible shock. All this." The housekeeper exhaled heavily, her face lined with sleepless exhaustion. "Oh, Miss Marple, I just can't make sense of it," she said, shaking her head. The colonel was always a man of routine. Every day, like clockwork, breakfast at 7, letters at 8, out in the garden by 10. And now, her voice broke slightly. She dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Miss Marple waited patiently. People, she had found, always spoke more freely when given time. And sure enough, after a moment, Mrs. Pettigrew lowered her voice. "The strangest thing, Miss Marple, is that someone came to see him that afternoon." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Someone, dear?" The housekeeper nodded vigorously. "Yes, just before 3 o'clock. I answered the door myself. Amana didn't recognize him. Tall, wearing a dark coat, and the colonel well. He seemed surprised to see him. Not pleased, mind you, just surprised." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over her handbag. "And did you hear what was said, sis?" Pettigrew shook her head quickly. "Oh no, miss. I don't listen at doors," which Miss Marple suspected was not entirely true, but I did hear the colonel say something rather odd as I passed by the study. She hesitated. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Go on, dear." The housekeeper sighed, then murmured, "He said you shouldn't have come back." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inside, she felt something click into place. The sun had begun its slow descent over Cranley St. James, casting long, golden shadows over the cobbled streets as Miss Marple made her way back from Hazelwood House. The scent of warm bread drifted from the bakery, mingling with the crisp autumn air. But despite the peaceful scene, the village was anything but tranquil. Murder had come to their doorstep, and the villagers, as expected, had reacted accordingly. By the time Miss Marple reached the Larkspur tea room, she was not at all surprised to find a gathering of concerned faces, whispering over cups of tea and cranberry scones. Mrs. Beatrice Withers and Mrs. Lavinia Ambrose would establish themselves as the leading authorities on all things scandalous, seated at their usual table, deep in heated discussion. Miss Marple, as was her way, quietly took her place nearby, ordered a pot of Darjeeling, and simply listened, because if there was one thing Miss Marple knew better than anyone, people always revealed more than they intended. "And I'm telling you," Mrs. Withers was saying, her voice a hushed but eager whisper, "I saw him myself. A strange man in a dark coat, standing just outside the post office that very afternoon. And you know what I think? I think it was him." Mrs. Ambrose raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Him?" Mrs. Withers leaned in dramatically. "It's a mysterious visitor, the one who went to see Colonel Bainbridge just before he was murdered." Mrs. Ambrose pursed her lips, considering. "And what exactly did this man look like, Beatrice?" Mrs. Withers faltered, just slightly. "I didn't see his face exactly. Okay. But he was tall, broad-shouldered, walking rather briskly as if he didn't want to be noticed." Miss Marple, without looking up from her tea, murmured softly, "But my dear, if he didn't want to be noticed, why would he stand outside the post office in the middle of the day?" Mrs. Withers blushed slightly, caught in her own excitement. "Well, maybe he was waiting for something, or someone. Mrs. Ambrose exhaled, exasperated. Really, Beatrice, you mustn't let your imagination run away with you. Miss Marple set down her cup gently, her gaze thoughtful. Oh, but I do believe Mrs. Withers has stumbled upon something rather interesting. Both women turned to her at once, their eyes wide with curiosity. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, her hands folding over her lap. You see, she said, the Colonel's housekeeper, Mrs. Pettigrew, mentioned that when she answered the door just before 3 o'clock. The Colonel seemed surprised to see his visitor. Not afraid, just surprised. Mrs. Withers nodded eagerly. Yes, that means he knew the man. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Indeed. And he said something rather curious before shutting the door. She let the words linger, allowing the weight of them to settle. He said, "You shouldn't have come back?" A hush fell over the tea room. Mrs. Ambrose stiffened, her fingers curling over the handle of her teacup. Mrs. Withers' eyes widened, her excitement momentarily giving way to genuine intrigue. Then that means? Miss Marple nodded once. It means that whoever visited Colonel Bainbridge that day was someone from his past. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Hugh Lester, the village physician. He was a man of calm demeanor, known for his no-nonsense approach and his deep understanding of the Cranley St. James community. And, as it happened, he had also been one of Colonel Bainbridge's oldest acquaintances. When Miss Marple arrived at his modest but well-kept home, as she was greeted with a curious glance. "Miss Marple," Dr. Lester said, motioning her inside. "What a pleasant surprise." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, my dear, I do hope I'm not intruding. I was simply passing by and thought you might share a cup of tea with an old friend." Dr. Lester, well aware that Miss Marple's curiosity was never idle, merely chuckled and led her to the sitting room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. They exchanged pleasantries for a while, discussing the state of the autumn weather, the latest church renovations, and Mrs. Cartwright's rather excessive use of nutmeg in her ginger. Biscuits before, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward Colonel Bainbridge. "You knew him quite well, didn't you?" she asked, stirring her tea. Dr. Lester nodded, his expression turning solemn. "Yes, we served together. In fact, many years ago. We weren't particularly close, but I respected him." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And did he ever mention anyone from his past? Someone he might have fallen out with?" Dr. Lester's fingers tightened around his teacup for the briefest moment. There was hesitation, and then, very quietly, he said a name. Howard Latimer. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but inside, her mind was already racing. Howard Latimer, a name from the past, a man who, it seemed, had unfinished business with Colonel Bainbridge. Miss Marple set down her cup, her blue eyes bright with understanding. "My dear Dr. Lester," she said pleasantly, "why do I get the feeling that this Mr. Latimer was not particularly welcome in Cranley St. James?" Dr. Lester sighed heavily, because, he admitted, the last time he was here, it ended very badly. By the time Miss Marple left Dr. Lester's house, the sky had turned a dusky shade of lavender, the first stars beginning to appear in the distance. And yet, despite the beauty of the evening, a chill had settled deep in her bones. Howard Latimer, a man who had once been part of Colonel Bainbridge's past, a man who had left Cranley St. James under mysterious circumstances, and now, a man who had returned then the very day the Colonel was murdered. Miss Marple paused at the end of the lane, gazing back at the village with a thoughtful expression. Yes, something was very, very wrong, and if she was not mistaken, this murder was only the beginning. The name Howard Latimer lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she walked back through Cranley St. James, the crisp evening air carrying the faint scent of burning wood from distant chimneys. It was a name that held weight, no eye she could tell, a name that had once belonged to this village, then disappeared only to return on the very day Colonel Bainbridge was murdered. Coincidence? Miss Marple didn't believe in coincidences, and neither, she suspected, did Dr. Lester. His reaction had been telling, that brief hesitation, the way his fingers tightened around his teacup, the quiet sigh that followed before he finally spoke the name. No, Dr. Lester knew something, and whatever it was tied to the reason Howard Latimer had left Cranley St. James all those years ago. Miss Marple was quite certain if she could uncover that reason, she would be one step closer to the truth by the time Miss Marple arrived at the Bluebell Tea Room the next morning. The village was already buzzing. Mrs. Beatrice Withers and Mrs. Lavinia Ambrose, the twin pillars of village gossip, were seated in their usual spot, deep in earnest conversation. Miss Marple, as always, settled into her chair nearby, ordered a pot of tea, and listened. And I heard from Mrs. Cartwright, who heard from the butcher's wife, there's been a sighting. Mrs. Withers whispered dramatically. Mrs. Ambrose raised an eyebrow. A sighting. Mrs. Withers nodded fervently, leaning in. Of him. Mrs. Ambrose's eyes narrowed slightly. Who, exactly? Mrs. Withers lowered her voice, as if afraid to speak the name too loudly. Howard Latimer. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Mrs. Ambrose let out a small gasp. You mean to say he's really back? Mrs. Withers nodded. Urgently. Someone saw him last night, near the old Ridgeway cottage, you remember? The one on the edge of town? Not lived in for years. Miss Marple set her cup down gently. Howard Latimer. Seen near an abandoned cottage, the night after Colonel Bainbridge was murdered. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Miss Marple did not believe in waiting for answers to come to her. She much preferred to go looking for them herself. So, that afternoon, she took a quiet walk toward Ridgeway Cottage. The cottage, as Mrs. Withers had said, had been empty for years. The garden was overgrown, the gate hanging slightly off its hinges, the windows dull with dust, but there were new footprints in the dirt path leading to the door, and the curtain in the front. So window had been disturbed. Someone had been here, and quite recently, too. Miss Marple approached slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. A discarded cigarette stub lay near the doorstep, not yet damp from the morning dew. Yes, someone had stood here, case, watching, waiting. She hesitated, then gave a gentle knock on the door. Silence. Miss Marple, of course, did not expect a response. She simply stood there a moment, listening, and then, just as she turned to leave, a floorboard creaked inside. Miss Marple froze. Someone was inside. Miss Marple, despite her frail appearance, was not a woman easily frightened. So, rather than rush away, she remained quite still, waiting. Another creak, then dashed the faintest rustling sound, as if someone were moving very cautiously. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, then called out in her most pleasant voice, "My dear, I do hope I'm not disturbing you." Silence, and then the door opened just a fraction, and a pair of watchful eyes peered out at her. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, a face worn by time, but unmistakably strong. A man who had once been a part of Cranley St. James and had now returned. Howard Latimer. His jaw tightened slightly as he took in the sight of Miss Marple standing on his doorstep. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with reluctant courtesy, he murmured, "You shouldn't be here." Miss Marple smiled kindly, though she did not move. "Oh, but I do think I should." Latimer exhaled slowly, stepping back slightly, his posture guarded. "Whatever you're looking for, miss." He hesitated. "Miss Marple, is it?" She nodded pleasantly. "That's right, dear." Latimer's gaze darkened. "You won't find it here." Miss Marple, of course, believed quite the opposite. For a brief moment, Howard Latimer simply stood there, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple waited, knowing that silence often led people to reveal more than words ever could. At last, Latimer sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I know why you're here, he muttered. It's about Bainbridge, isn't it? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Well, my dear, it is rather a topic of interest, wouldn't you say? Latimer's jaw tightened. I didn't kill him, he said flatly. Miss Marple did not react. Oh, my dear, I never said you did. Latimer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to determine just how much she already knew. Miss Marple folded her hands. But you were there, weren't you? A tense silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Latimer exhaled, shaking his head. Yes, he admitted. I was there. Miss Marple smiled softly, feeling the pieces begin to shift into place. Why, dear? She asked gently. Latimer hesitated, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Because Bainbridge owed me a debt. Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly over her handbag. A debt that changed everything, because debts, she well knew, often led to murder. Miss Marple stood calmly on the doorstep of Ridgeway Cottage, her sharp blue eyes fixed upon Howard Latimer. The man had just admitted he had been at Hazelwood House on the afternoon Colonel Bainbridge was murdered, and more importantly, he had mentioned a debt that, it seemed, had brought him back to Cranley St. James after all these years. Miss Marple, ever composed, adjusted her shawl against the cool autumn air and regarded him pleasantly. A debt, dear? She echoed. Now, that is rather interesting. Latimer's jaw tightened, as if regretting his own words. I didn't mean money, he muttered. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. No, my dear, I rather suspected you didn't. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Then, at last, Latimer sighed heavily, running a hand through his dark, grizzled hair. I didn't come back to kill him, he said quietly. I came back because he owed me something more important than money. Miss Marple waited patiently. She had long learned that, given time, people often filled their own silences, and sure enough, Latimer exhaled deeply, then murmured, The Colonel owed me justice. Inside Ridgeway Cottage, the air smelled of dust and disuse, but there were signs that someone had been living here. Again, a half-burned candle on the mantel, a coat draped over a chair, a kettle resting cold and unused on the stove. Miss Marple sat gracefully in the only armchair that didn't creak too much, two knitting resting on her lap. Howard Latimer, still restless, leaned against the fireplace, staring into nothing. After a long silence, he finally spoke. 20 years ago, he murmured, I lived in Cranley St. James. I was a young man, then hot-headed, foolish. In Bainbridge, he wasn't Colonel Bainbridge yet, but he was already a man of influence. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging him to continue. He ruined someone, Latimer said flatly. A girl, Lenore Walsh. Miss Marple knitted thoughtfully. And what happened to her, dear? Latimer's hands curled into fists. She disappeared, he said, voice low, vanished. Bainbridge had cast her aside. She simply disappeared. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, though inside she felt the weight of the words. And you blamed Colonel Bainbridge? She asked gently. Latimer's eyes flashed. I don't just blame him, he said bitterly. I know. I knew then, and I know now. But no one believed me. No one wanted to believe that their fine, respectable Geoffrey Bainbridge could be. He stopped himself, his breath shuddering slightly. Miss Marple patted her knitting. Such things do tend to get swept under the rug, she said softly. Latimer gave a short, bitter laugh. Swept under. They buried it. They called her a liar, said she must have run off with some man. But she didn't. She's dead, Miss Marple. I know she is. Miss Marple met his gaze, her own steady and unreadable. And you came back, she murmured, to make Colonel Bainbridge answer for it. Latimer let out a slow breath. Yes. Miss Marple sat very still. letting the new information settle into place. A girl's disappearance, a man returning after 20 years, and a murdered colonel who had been in the middle of writing a letter before he died. Miss Marple thought of that letter, the one she had seen on Colonel Bainbridge's desk. The ink still wet, the final words unfinished. I must put an end to this at once. The truth must come out before what? Before he was killed. Miss Marple glanced at Latimer, who was now pacing, his movements restless, agitated. My dear, did you confront the colonel that day? She asked gently. Latimer hesitated. Then, yes, he admitted. I went to Hazelwood House just before 3 o'clock. I told him it was time to tell the truth. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly together. And how did he respond? Latimer let out a humorless laugh. He was afraid, he muttered. For the first time in his life, Bainbridge looked afraid. He tried to tell me he was going to do the right thing, that he was going to set things right. Miss Marple stilled. Set things right, she repeated. Latimer nodded. He said he had been writing a letter, that he was finally telling the truth. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over her knitting. And then, my dear, Latimer let out a slow breath. Then, I left. He shook his head. I didn't believe him. Thought he was just trying to get rid of me. But, I swear to you, Miss Marple, when I walked out of that house, he was still alive. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered. Yes, perhaps he had been, but not for long. Miss Marple rose gracefully, smoothing down her skirts. My dear, you have been most helpful, she said warmly. Latimer gave a dry chuckle. Not sure I see how. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Oh, but I do. As she stepped outside, the wind stirred the trees, sending golden leaves swirling across the path. Miss Marple turned toward Hazelwood House. Kea, her mind racing through the puzzle, because now, last, pieces were falling into place, just like the clock in the Larkspur tea room. Miss Marple paused, considering a clock does not stop on its own. It stops when someone wants it to stop, which meant someone had tampered with the time of death. Someone who wanted Howard Latimer to be the obvious suspect. Someone who had been inside Hazelwood House after Latimer left. Someone who had finished what Colonel Bainbridge was about to reveal. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Yes, she knew who the murderer was, but now she needed proof. Miss Marple walked slowly through the quiet streets of Cranley St. James, the autumn air crisp and tinged with the faint scent of burning wood. Though the village remained outwardly unchanged, she could sense the undercurrent of who needs a killer walked among them, and yet the wrong man had taken the blame. Howard Latimer had visited Colonel Bainbridge that afternoon. That much was certain. But he had not been the one to kill him. The true murderer had arrived after Latimer left. The true murderer had stopped the grandfather clock at Hazelwood House. Just as someone had stopped the clock in the Larkspur tea room. The true murderer had seen what Bainbridge was writing, had realized that their secret, whatever it was about to come to light. And so, they had silenced him. Miss Marple had an idea who it was, but now she needed proof. The Larkspur tea room was unusually quiet when Miss Marple stepped inside. The usual air of pleasant gossip had been replaced by a kind of wary tension, as though the very walls of Cranley St. James were holding their breath. Mrs. Beatrice Withers and Mrs. Lavinia Ambrose, always eager purveyors of information, sat near the window, their voices hushed. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a pot of Assam tea, and listened. Mrs. Withers leaned in. They say the police are watching him. Mrs. Ambrose frowned. Watching who? Beatrice. Mrs. Withers lowered her voice. Howard Latimer. Of course. Who else? It's obvious, isn't it? He came back after all these years, demanded something from Bainbridge. Didn't get it, so he killed him. Miss Marple set down her teacup gently. Oh, my dear, sometimes the obvious suspect is precisely the one we should doubt the most. Mrs. Ambrose turned to her, curious. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "Mean? Dear, that things are rarely as simple as they appear." And, with that, she set her trap into motion. Miss Marple had learned long ago that murderers rarely acted alone, not in the sense of accomplices, but in the way they betrayed themselves. Fear had a way of exposing the guilty, and so she planted a seed at the bakery. She let slip. It's strange, isn't it? A man like Colonel Bainbridge, so meticulous, yet leaving an unfinished letter behind. At the post office, she mused, I do wonder what was in that letter. Such an important message, never sent. And at the Bluebell Tea Room, she sighed. You know, sometimes I think the real danger isn't a person who arrives unexpectedly, but the one who has been there all along. The effect was almost immediate. By that evening, Miss Marple could feel the shift in the village's mood. People were whispering. Doubt was creeping in, and somewhere, the murderer was beginning to panic. It was well past 9 o'clock when Miss Marple heard the knock at her door. Not unexpected, not at all. She rose gracefully, lit a small oil lamp, and opened the door. Dr. Hugh Lester stood before her, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. You've been saying things, Miss Marple, he said, his voice tight. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Why, Dr. Lester, what a surprise. Dr. Lester stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being seen. Miss Marple, ever the hostess, gestured toward a chair. Would you care for tea, dear? Dr. Lester ignored her. You've been stirring up trouble, he said. Sharply, whispers. Suspicions people are starting to ask questions. Miss Marple sat down across from him, folding her hands. And are you afraid of those questions, Dr. Lester? A long silence. Then, very quietly, you shouldn't have done this, he murmured. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over her knitting. Ah, there it was. Dr. Lester sat forward, his expression tense, haunted. You don't understand, he said, his voice low. Bainbridge, he was a cruel man. He destroyed lives. Miss Marple nodded gently, like Eleanor Walsh's. Dr. Lester's face drained of color, and in that moment, Miss Marple knew the truth completely. It was you, she said softly. Dr. Lester let out a shuddering breath. I didn't mean to, he whispered. Miss Marple waited, and then the whole story tumbled out. Dr. Lester had once been in love with Eleanor Walsh. When Bainbridge ruined her, he had tried to fight for her, but no one had believed him. When she disappeared, he had suspected the worst, but had no proof. And then, all these years later, Bainbridge had finally admitted the truth, but too late. He said he was going to write a confession. Dr. Lester murmured, to put it all in writing. Miss Marple nodded. Tight. But if that confession had been sent, the whole village would have known what happened. Dr. Lester closed his eyes. I couldn't let it happen, he whispered. I couldn't let it all come out now, after all these years. Miss Marple sighed softly. Murder was rarely about hatred alone. It was often about fear, and Dr. Lester had been afraid. Afraid of his own past. Afraid of the shame, the guilt, the whispers that would follow. And so he had silenced Bainbridge and tampered with the clocks, ensuring that Howard Latimer would take the blame instead. But fear, as Miss Marple well knew, had a way of betraying itself in the end, and now the trap had closed. The confession hung in the air like a dark storm cloud, the weight of it pressing against the small sitting room in Miss Marple's cottage. Dr. Hugh Lester sat across from her, his hands still clenched into fists, his breath shallow. He had spoken the truth, or, at least, part of it. Miss Marple, ever composed, let the silence stretch a moment longer, watching him with quiet consideration. She had learned long ago that guilt had a way of breaking down even the most composed individuals, and Dr. Lester was no exception. He had killed Colonel Bainbridge. That much was clear, but the why still needed unraveling completely. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her fingers moving deftly over the soft yarn. "You say you didn't mean to, Dr. Lester," she murmured. "Yet, murder is rarely committed without intent." Dr. Lester let out a sharp breath, his jaw tightening. I don't expect you to understand, Miss Marple." His voice was strained, but behind it, there was something else, not just regret, but fear. Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting. "Oh, but I do understand, dear. You see, you weren't just afraid of what Colonel Bainbridge's confession would mean for him. You were afraid of what it would mean for you." Dr. Lester flinched. His fingers twitched as though he wanted to reach for something, perhaps a handkerchief, perhaps a drink, but instead they remained clenched in his lap. Miss Marple sighed, shaking her head slightly. "I dare say you believed that letter would ruin your reputation, but it wasn't just that, was it?" Dr. Lester swallowed. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "That you weren't trying to protect yourself, Doctor. You were trying to protect someone else." The room went very still. Dr. Lester's eyes darted to the side for a fraction of a second, so quick that most would have missed it. Miss Marple did not miss anything, and suddenly, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The moment Miss Marple uttered those words, she could see the struggle on Dr. Lester's face. He had spent years burying the past, and now, in the course of a single evening, get it all come undone. She folded her hands neatly over her lap, watching him with the kind patience of a woman who already knew the answer but wanted the guilty party to say it aloud. "You were in love with Eleanor Walsh," she said softly. Dr. Lester stiffened. "It has nothing to do with this." Miss Marple's voice remained steady. It has everything to do with this. She was wronged by Colonel Bainbridge, and yet she was the one who disappeared. I do not believe she ran away, nor do I believe she left by choice. So, Doctor, if she did not leave of her own will—" She let the words linger. Dr. Lester's hands tightened over the arms of his chair. "You have no proof?" he muttered. Miss Marple offered him a small smile. "Oh, but I do, dear. You see, secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they are buried." Dr. Lester let out a slow, shuddering breath. "You don't understand. You weren't here when it happened." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Then, why don't you explain it to me?" Dr. Lester let out a mirthless chuckle. "You won't let this go, will you?" Miss Marple smiled. "I am afraid not, dear." At first, Dr. Lester didn't speak. He simply sat there, his breathing uneven, his eyes trained on some invisible spot on the floor. Then, at last, his voice broke the silence. "Eleanor didn't disappear," he said quietly. "She was taken." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "Taken." Dr. Lester swallowed. Bainbridge had powerful friends. He arranged for Eleanor to be sent away. His voice shook. Somewhere where no one would ask questions. No one would come looking. Miss Marple felt a chill creep up her spine. "And you knew?" Dr. Lester let out a hollow laugh. "Not at first. I spent months looking for her. I thought she might have gone to London, or perhaps had been taken in by distant relatives. But then, one night, Bainbridge summoned me to Hazelwood House." His voice became distant, as if he were reliving the moment he told me the truth. Told me there was no use searching anymore. That Eleanor was gone, and she wasn't coming back. Miss Marple's grip on her knitting needles tightened. She had suspected something dark lay at the heart of this mystery. But this was monstrous. She exhaled softly. "And so, you waited?" Dr. Lester nodded. "For 20 years, I waited." He closed his eyes, and then, out of nowhere, Bainbridge sent for me. He said he had been writing a letter, full confession, was ready to set things right. Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper. But you didn't let him. Dr. Lester let out a shuddering breath. I couldn't. That letter. It had been sent. It would have exposed everything. His voice cracked. It would have exposed that I knew all along, that I did nothing. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Cancel? You killed him? Dr. Lester lowered his head into his hands. I didn't mean to, he murmured. I just wanted him to stop. I went to Hazelwood House. I saw the letter on his desk, K. And then he swallowed hard. He laughed, K. He said it was all too late. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, and so you made sure it was. Dr. Lester let out a shaky breath. Yes. Silence stretched between them once more, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on Miss Marple's mantel. Finally, she spoke. You tampered with the clocks, she murmured. Dr. Lester nodded slowly. Yes, I set the time back. I knew. Latimer had come earlier. I thought if I made it look like the murder happened while he was there. His voice trailed off. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Clever plan, but not quite clever enough. Dr. Lester looked up at her, his expression one of quiet resignation. You've already told the police, haven't you? Miss Marple offered. Him a small, sad smile. Not yet, dear. Dr. Lester let out a breath. But you will. Miss Marple said nothing, and in that silence, Dr. Lester understood everything. The trap had been set, and now it had snapped shut. The following morning, Cranley St. James awoke to a village forever changed. Dr. Lester was taken into police custody, his confession given freely. The town buzzed with shock and disbelief. But Miss Marple remained, as she always had, calm, observant, and quietly knowing. She sat in her favorite chair, knitting in hand, listening as the world sorted itself out once more, because murder, she had long understood, was rarely a matter of mere violence. It was always, in the end, a matter of human nature, and human nature never changed. The news of Dr. Lester's confession spread through Cranley St. James like wildfire. The village, once settled in its quiet, predictable rhythm, was now alive with whispers, scandal, and disbelief that the respected village doctor, a man who had spent years tending to the ailments and worries of the townsfolk, had been the one to murder Colonel Bainbridge, seemed unthinkable. And yet, Miss Marple had always known that murder was rarely a matter of appearances. She had seen it time and time again. The most well-respected citizens often held the darkest secrets. And now, one of those secrets had come to light. But even as Dr. Lester sat in police custody, his confession given, his fate all but sealed, Miss Marple felt a strange unease settle over her, because something still wasn't quite right. Something was missing, and until she found it, the case, in her mind at least, wasn't over by mid-morning. The town square was buzzing with discussion. Miss Marple had taken her usual seat at the Larkspur tea room, where the conversations flowed as freely as the tea that Mrs. Beatrice Withers and Mrs. Lavinia Ambrose sat beside her, both speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Well, I must say, I never suspected Dr. Lester, Mrs. Withers said, shaking her head. I mean, imagine a man like him committing such a crime. Mrs. Ambrose pursed her lips. I don't know, Beatrice. I always thought he was too serious, if you understand me, Mrs. Withers scoffed. Oh, Lavinia, everyone in Cranley St. James is serious. Miss Marple, stirring her tea gently, interjected. But I do wonder, dear, if he was serious enough. Both women turned to her at once, their eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Withers blinked. Whatever do you mean, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled mildly. Simply that Dr. Lester's confession, while quite convenient, seems rather lacking. Mrs. Ambrose frowned. Lacking. Miss Marple nodded, adjusting her shawl. It all fits, doesn't it? Too well, I think. The confession, the motive, the tampered clocks. It's all so neatly tied together. Mrs. Withers leaned in slightly. But isn't that what you wanted? Miss Marple gave a small hum of agreement, but her eyes were distant, thoughtful. Yes, dear. But I cannot help but feel that sometimes the neatest solutions are not always the truest ones. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the village, her thoughts churning. Dr. Lester had confessed. He had admitted to the murder, but something about his story, about the way he had spoken, felt off, that his emotions had been real enough, his grief, his guilt. But guilt did not always mean guilt for murder. She thought of Colonel Bainbridge's final words, spoken to Howard Latimer. You shouldn't have come back. Had those words been intended for Latimer alone, or had they been meant for someone else entirely? And then there was the matter of the letter, the confession Bainbridge had been writing before he died. If Dr. Lester had been so desperate to keep it from being sent, why had he left it sitting on the desk? Why not burn it, destroy it completely? Miss Marple stopped in the middle of the village lane, her sharp mind clicking into place. The answer was simple. Dr. Lester hadn't destroyed the letter because he hadn't killed Bainbridge at all. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Cranley St. James, Miss Marple paid one final visit to Hazelwood's house. The estate had remained eerily quiet since Bainbridge's murder, the heavy presence of death lingering in its halls. She was met at the door by Mrs. Alice Pettigrew, the late Colonel's housekeeper. Miss Marple gave her a warm, reassuring smile. Mrs. Pettigrew, dear, I was wondering if I might trouble you for a moment of your time. The housekeeper, still wearing the expression of a woman deeply unsettled, nodded and stepped aside. Miss Marple entered the study of the room where it had all happened and let her eyes roam across the space, noting the untouched furniture, the fireplace, now cold, the heavy mahogany desk where Colonel Bainbridge had taken his final breath. Then her gaze landed on the grandfather clock, and suddenly she saw it, the one detail that had been nagging at her all along. The clock had stopped at 3:15 p.m. More so, it seemed. Miss Marple took a careful step closer, peering at the dust on the clock's pendulum. A faint line had been drawn through the dust, a smudge where fingers had pressed against the metal. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Someone had reset the time. Yes, but not at the time of the murder, after, which meant the true murderer had done more than simply frame Dr. Lester. They had let him believe he was guilty, and that, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the cruelest part of all. The next morning, Miss Marple gathered a small but significant audience in the Larkspur tea room. Inspector Graves sat at the table beside her, looking both intrigued and exasperated, while Dr. Lester, now released from custody, though visibly shaken, stared down at his hands. Howard Latimer was there as well, watching Miss Marple with a quiet intensity, as though he had long since resigned himself to the fact that only she could untangle the mess that had been made. Mrs. Pettigrew stood nervously near the back, twisting a lace handkerchief between her fingers. Miss Marple, seated as though she were merely hosting a pleasant afternoon gathering, took a sip of tea and then spoke. The real murderer, she said, was not Dr. Lester. Inspector Graves narrowed his eyes. Miss Marple, she raised a gentle hand. Please, dear, allow me a moment. She turned to Dr. Lester, her expression kind but firm. Doctor, you believed you killed Colonel Bainbridge. You believed it because the true murderer allowed you to believe it, because they wanted you to take the blame. Dr. Lester's hands tightened into fists. But Ty was there, Miss Marple nodded patiently. Yes, dear, you were there. But when you left, the Colonel was still alive. The room fell silent, and then Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the real murderer. Mrs. Pettigrew gasped softly. Miss Marple smiled sadly, because now, at last, the true crime had come to light, and in the next moment she would reveal exactly who had killed Colonel Bainbridge. The evening had arrived in Cranley St. James, and the village seemed to hold its breath. A sense of unease that had settled over the town after the revelation of Dr. Lester's involvement in Colonel Bainbridge's death still lingered. It seemed to hang in the air, seeping into every corner of the village, even as the bustle of everyday life continued. Miss Marple, however, had seemed through the surface calm. She knew that the real murderer still walked free, even now, as the village tried to regain its rhythm. The true culprit had not been exposed. Her thoughts were fixed on the smudge of ink she had discovered in the Colonel's study. It had been a small thing, almost insignificant, but to Miss Marple, it was the thread that had begun to unravel the mystery. Colonel had not been writing his confession in a rush, nor had he been interrupted by an angry man. The real murderer had been someone with access to him, someone who knew exactly what the Colonel was planning to reveal. As Miss Marple left Hazelwood House, her mind raced. Who else could have been involved? She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to find him. Miss Marple's footsteps echoed softly along the cobblestone street as she walked toward the Bluebell Tea Room, her thoughts ever shifting, like a puzzle slowly clicking together. She had already been over the details in her mind a dozen times, but now she needed one last confirmation. As she entered the tea room, the usual hum of conversation stopped for a moment. Miss Marple took her seat, ordering a pot of Darjeeling tea and waiting. She knew who was going to walk in next. She had already set her plans into motion, and sure enough, moments later, the door opened. And Mrs. Alice Pettigrew, the Colonel's housekeeper, walked in. Her face was drawn. She moved as though she were carrying an invisible burden, her eyes flicking nervously around the room. It was clear that she had been summoned, though she did not know why. Miss Marple smiled softly, gesturing for her to sit. "Mrs. Pettigrew, dear, I'm so glad you could join me." Mrs. Pettigrew gave a nervous nod, her hands wringing a handkerchief in her lap. I don't know what to say, Miss Marple. The whole town is in an uproar, and She trailed off, her voice faltering. I never thought anything like this could happen. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Dang, Mrs. Pettigrew, it's been a difficult time for you. But I do need to ask you something important. The housekeeper's hands clenched tighter around the fabric of her handkerchief, but she nodded in silence. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but the sharpness of her words cut through the tension in the room. I need you to tell me about the night Colonel Bainbridge died. What exactly happened that evening? You must know something that no one else does. Mrs. Pettigrew's breath caught in her throat. She looked up, but only for a moment, her gaze darting quickly to the door, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she spoke. I did see something, Miss Marple. Something that perhaps I should have told the police, but I couldn't bring myself to. Didn't know who to trust. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the older woman's face. Tell me, Mrs. Pettigrew, what did you see? The housekeeper closed her eyes briefly, as though steeling herself. I was outside, tending to the garden, just before 3 o'clock. I'd seen the Colonel through the window, sitting at his desk, writing. He seemed focused. Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated, her fingers trembling. But then I saw a man approach the house. I didn't see his face, but I could tell he was tall, broad-shouldered. I thought he might have been a servant, or perhaps someone from the village, but when he entered the house, it felt. She trailed off, her voice wavering. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Who was this man, Mrs. Pettigrew, who came into the house? The housekeeper's hands tightened around the handkerchief. I don't know for sure, but I've always thought it was Dr. Lester. He had been so familiar with the Colonel. Thought maybe they were discussing something important. But when I saw him leave, she swallowed hard. The look on his face, it wasn't like him at all. He looked like someone who had just lost everything. Miss Marple felt a tinge of certainty. Dr. Lester had been involved, but not as the murderer. No, the pieces were slowly falling into place now. She sat back in her chair, her expression calm, but thoughtful. And when you saw him leave, what did you do? Miss Pettigrew wiped her brow with the handkerchief. I didn't think much of it at the time. He had left, and I went back to my work. But later, when I heard the police come for the colonel, when they told me he was to die, remembered what I had seen. Miss Marple's voice softened. And what did you remember, dear? Mrs. Pettigrew's face turned pale. I remember. The clock in the studyette had been stopped. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now I wonder if someone who didn't want the colonel's secret revealed had stopped it. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Stopped it. At exactly the right time, you mean? Mrs. Pettigrew nodded slowly. Yes, it's the only thing that makes sense now. Someone had tampered with the clock to make sure no one knew exactly when the colonel had died. Miss Marple's heart quickened, the final realization hitting her like a wave. Someone who had access to the house, someone who could control the timeline, who could keep the murder from being linked to them. Her voice grew softer, yet the weight of her words was undeniable. Someone who didn't want their own role in the colonel's death to come out. Mrs. Pettigrew looked at her, eyes wide. You don't mean? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, Mrs. Pettigrew. The true murderer is not Dr. Lester. It's someone who was in this very room that afternoon. Someone who could make sure the colonel was silenced before he revealed everything. Mrs. Pettigrew gasped. You mean, not Dr. Lester? Miss Marple shook her head. No, I have no doubt that Dr. Lester was involved, but not in the way we thought. The real murderer was someone with the most to lose if that letter was ever sent to the authorities. The truth was now so close Miss Marple could almost taste it. She had gathered the pieces of the puzzle, each detail, each conversation, every small clue, and they were all beginning to form a picture that was clear, yet deeply unsettling. As she sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, her knitting resting in her lap, Miss Marple's thoughts turned again to the final moments of Colonel Bainbridge's life. The letter, the confession he had been writing, the stopped clocks, the strange man who had arrived at Hazelwood House that afternoon, and now a crucial piece had fallen into place. It wasn't Dr. Lester. It wasn't Howard Latimer. How was someone with access to Hazelwood House, someone who had been in the room that afternoon, someone who had the most to lose? Miss Marple knew who it was. She had suspected for some time, but now was no doubt in her mind. It was Mrs. Alice Pettigrew, Colonel's housekeeper. The evening was drawing to a close when Miss Marple made her way back to Hazelwood House, steps deliberate and slow. There was a quiet finality to her movements, as though she were preparing to close a chapter, not just in this case, but in her understanding of human nature itself. Mrs. Pettigrew had always seemed like a harmless woman, a simple housekeeper, loyal to her employer, perhaps a little too proud of her years of service. But Miss Marple had seen the cracks in the facade, the faint flickers of nervousness in the woman's eyes. Miss Marple was certain now. Mrs. Pettigrew had killed Colonel Bainbridge, and not because of anger or personal malice. No, it was far more calculated. A crime born of fear, the fear of what would happen if the colonel's confession reached the authorities. As Miss Marple approached the grand entrance of Hazelwood's house, she noticed the lights dimmed in the windows. There was a sense of peaceful stillness, but it was an artificial calm that had been manufactured. The door creaked open as Miss Marple pressed the heavy knocker, and Mrs. Pettigrew greeted her once more, her expression weary, her hands still twisting that familiar handkerchief. I've been expecting you, Miss Marple, Mrs. Pettigrew said softly, her voice quivering slightly. I think I know what you're here to say. Miss Marple smiled warmly, but her eyes were steady and sharp. Do you, Mrs. Pettigrew? I'm not sure you do. They sat in the parlor, the heavy silence thickening between them. Mrs. Pettigrew appeared lost in thought, eyes darting nervously to the clock on the mantelpiece, the very one that had stopped at 3:15 p.m. Miss Marple waited. Patience was a virtue in these moments. At last, Mrs. Pettigrew's voice broke the silence. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her tone heavy with regret. "But I couldn't let him tell the truth." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "Who, Mrs. Pettigrew? Who was he protecting?" Kay. The housekeeper's eyes flashed with fear, and she looked away. But Miss Marple was not finished. "I know you were the one who tampered with the clocks," Miss Marple continued, "and I know that you were the one who tried to frame Dr. Lester for the murder. But the truth is much more complicated, isn't it?" Mrs. Pettigrew's face drained of color, her hands trembling in her lap. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He was going to ruin everything." "Who was Mrs. Pettigrew?" "The Colonel." Miss Marple's voice softened. "You didn't kill him because you were angry at him. You killed him because he knew something that threatened everything." Mrs. Pettigrew's breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, her voice came out in a ragged whisper. "I loved him." Miss Marple didn't flinch, though the admission hung in the air like a shadow. It was a confession of a different sort, one that revealed not just the motive, but the depths of the human heart. "You loved him," Miss Marple repeated gently. "But it wasn't just that, was it? You knew the truth. You knew he was about to expose the secrets that could destroy your life. You had been covering for him for years, hadn't you?" Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes filled with tears, but her face remained resolute. "I couldn't let him destroy what we had, what I had built. No one could know what really happened to Eleanor Walsh. I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I could stop him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Understanding, you stopped him." Her voice softened, but only for a time. "You thought if you could kill him, the truth would die with him. But, as always, the truth has a way of finding its way out." Mrs. Pettigrew's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, her face pale with fear. "I didn't want to hurt him. But when he said he was writing that letter, when he said he was going to expose everything about me, about Eleanor, about Oos, I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't lose everything." Miss Marple sat back, letting the weight of the confession hang in the room. "You didn't have to lose it, Mrs. Pettigrew. You could have told the truth. But instead, you let your fear control you, and that's what led to the death of Colonel Bainbridge. That's what led to the murder." The truth was finally out, but Miss Marple could see that justice was not yet served. Mrs. Pettigrew was caught. The weight of her confession still seemed to hang heavily between them. "What will happen to me?" Mrs. Pettigrew whispered, her hands still trembling. Miss Marple looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "You will have to face the consequences of your actions, Mrs. Pettigrew. But that doesn't mean you have to carry this burden alone. There are those who will understand." In time, Mrs. Pettigrew closed her eyes, the weight of her actions finally settling in. "I never wanted to be part of something like this. I thought if I kept it hidden, I could protect him. But in the end, it was me who killed him. It was my fear that led to his death." Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft but steady. "Fear makes us do terrible things, Mrs. Pettigrew, but it also makes us admit the truth when the time comes." The housekeeper sat silently, lost in her own thoughts. Miss Marple knew that justice would be done, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of those who had been touched by the crime. The air in Cranley St. James had shifted. The village, once wrapped in the cocoon of daily routines and unspoken secrets, now stood on the edge of a new chapter. The clock that had stopped in Colonel Bainbridge's study had been restarted. Just the time, but the truth itself, Miss Marple had always known that truth would find its way to the surface, no matter how deep the lie was buried. But the truth, as she had learned over the years, was not always clean and tidy. Sometimes it took time, patience, and a sharp understanding of human nature to uncover. Now that the murder had been solved and Mrs. Pettigrew had confessed, the village was in turmoil, caught between relief and resentment. And yet, amid the confusion, Miss Marple remained steady. It was always this way with her. While others rushed to judgment or acted out of fear, she remained calm, watching, waiting, and understanding. As she sat in her small parlor later that evening, Miss Marple reflected on the case with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had solved it, as she always did, with logical precision and an understanding of the human heart. But there was something about this case, something about Mrs. Pettigrew's confession, that left her feeling unsettled. Perhaps it was the nature of the crime, how it had been born out of fear and love, how it had been a long, slow descent into darkness. Or perhaps it was the realization that sometimes the greatest tragedy lay not in the crime itself, but in the consequences that rippled through the lives of those who had been caught in its wake. The days following Mrs. Pettigrew's arrest were marked by quiet murmurs and furtive glances. The village had always been a place where secrets festered beneath the surface, but now those secrets had been dragged into the light, and the town had no idea how to react. By the time Miss Marple sat with the local constable in the drawing room of her cottage, a more stable calm had begun to settle in. Inspector Graves had been summoned from a nearby town to handle the final steps of the investigation. Though he had been skeptical of Miss Marple's approach from the beginning, he could not argue with the results. She had been the one to piece together the truth. After all, I must admit, Miss Marple, Graves said, leaning back in his chair, you've certainly shown us all a thing or two. The case seemed so clear, Dr. Lester, the man who had been closest to the colonel, the one with the most to gain. Yet, you were the one who saw through the smoke screen. Miss Marple smiled warmly, though her eyes remained focused. You see, Inspector, it's never just about the most obvious suspect. Sometimes we must look closer at those who seem the most innocent. The truth has a way of hiding in the places we least expect it. Graves nodded thoughtfully, and Miss Marple could sense a shift in his demeanor. It was no longer the hasty dismissal of a town's quirky old detective, but a new understanding. The case was over, but the wisdom had settled in. So, what becomes of Mrs. Pettigrew now? He asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of professional curiosity and something more human, a genuine sympathy for the housekeeper who had found herself caught in the web of guilt and fear. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Justice must be served, of course, but it is not the law alone that must judge her, Inspector. It is human nature. Mrs. Pettigrew acted out of a desperate need to protect herself and someone else the colonel's secret, honed, hidden past. But in the end, her actions destroyed the very thing she tried to protect. Graves sighed. It's hard to imagine though, that woman, with all her years of service, that one night, one decision to silence him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. We all carry secrets, Inspector. Some are small and harmless, while others have consequences. The trial of Mrs. Alice Pettigrew went forward as expected. She was found guilty of murder, though the judge showed her leniency in light of her age and the circumstances surrounding the crime. There was no question about her guilt, but there was something almost tragic in her story. A woman so devoted to her past, so afraid of losing everything, she resorted to murder in the hope of preserving a lie. In a small village like Cranley St. James, the consequences of such a crime were far-reaching. The villagers had been forced to confront not just the murder of their beloved colonel, but the dark secrets that lay hidden in their own midst. But as time passed, life began to return to its normal rhythm. The church bells tolled every Sunday, and the tea room once again became a place of gossip and friendly chatter. Yet, the lessons of the past lingered in the hearts of the villagers. People were no longer as quick to judge others, or at least, they didn't speak it aloud. Miss Marple, as always, remained a constant in the village. The townsfolk still came to her for advice, and though she had become more of a legend in their eyes, her modesty and quiet observation were never overshadowed by her sharp mind. The case of Colonel Bainbridge's murder had ended, but in Miss Marple's eyes, it was one of many examples of how human nature had a way of unraveling itself when pushed too far. It was a story of fear, guilt, and love, one that had played out in front of the entire village, but which only Miss Marple had fully understood. Weeks later, as the autumn leaves fell and the chill of winter began to creep into the air, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The quiet had returned to Cranley St. James, and yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. She had solved the mystery of Colonel Bainbridge's death. But what about the deeper truths that had remained hidden for so long? The fear that had driven Mrs. Pettigrew to kill, the guilt that had gnawed at the hearts of those who had kept a secret of Eleanor. Walsh's disappearance, all of it would remain unanswered. But Miss Marple had always known that some things were never meant to be fully understood. Sometimes the pieces simply fell into place, and other times the story was just too complicated for any resolution to feel satisfying. The mystery of the Colonel's death was over. But as Miss Marple sat in the glow of the fire, she knew that the real answers had always been within. The human heart, after all, was the most complicated puzzle of all.